He's tied to a wooden plank. He's already been tortured to some degree. But he thinks he's heard O'Brien's voice. Once, Winston could not remember whether it was in drugged sleep or normal sleep, or even in a moment of wakefulness. A voice murmured in his ear, "Don't worry, Winston. You are in my keeping. For 7 years I have watched over you. Now the turning point has come. I shall save you. I shall make you perfect." I do him in the accent of a northern school teacher in England, as he's described by Orwell. As Winston comes to, he discovers himself flat on his back and unable to move. His body was held down at every essential point. Even the back of his head was gripped in some manner. O'Brien was looking down at him gravely and rather sadly. His face, seen from below, looked coarse and worn, with pouches under the eyes and tired lines from nose to chin. He was older than Winston had thought him. He was perhaps 48 or 50. Under his hand there was a dial with a lever on top and figures running around the face of the dial. "I told you," said O'Brien, "that if we met again, it would be here. This is room 101. "Yes," said Winston. Without any warning except a slight movement of O'Brien's hand, a wave of pain flooded Winston's body. It was a frightening pain because he could not see what was happening, and he had the feeling that some mortal injury was being done to him. He did not know whether the thing was really happening or whether the effect was electrically produced, but his body was being wrenched out of shape. The joints were slowly being torn apart. Although the pain had brought the sweat out on his forehead, the worst of all was the fear that his backbone was about to snap. He set his teeth and breathed hard through his nose, trying to keep silent as long as possible. "You are afraid," said O'Brien, watching his face, "that in another moment something is going to break. Your especial fear is that it will be your backbone. You have a vivid mental picture of the vertebrae snapping apart and the spinal fluid dripping out of them. That is what you are thinking, is it not, Winston?" Winston did not answer. O'Brien drew back the lever on the dial. The wave of pain receded almost as quickly as it had come. "That was 40, said O'Brien. "You can see that the numbers on this dial run up to 100. Will you please remember throughout our conversation that I have it in my power to inflict pain on you at any moment and to whatever degree I choose. If you tell me any lies or attempt to prevaricate in any way, or even fall below your usual level of intelligence, you will cry out with pain. Instantly. Do you understand?" "Yes," said Winston. O'Brien's manner became less severe. He resettled his spectacles thoughtfully, took a pace or two up and down. When he spoke, his voice was gentle and patient. He had the air of a doctor, a teacher, even a priest. Anxious to explain and persuade rather than to punish. "I am taking trouble with you, Winston," he said, "because you are worth trouble. You know perfectly well what is the matter with you. You have known it for years, though you have fought against the knowledge. You are mentally deranged. You suffer from a defective memory. You are unable to remember real events, and you persuade yourself that you remember other events which never happened. Fortunately, it is curable. You have never cured yourself of it because you did not choose to." And then he asks him a series of questions, which Winston attempts to answer. Finally, he gets to the big question. "Some years ago, you had a very serious delusion indeed." And you remember this from the beginning of the book. We've seen it happen in the book. "You believed that three men, three one-time party members, named Jones, Aronson, and Rutherford, men who were executed for treachery and sabotage, after making the fullest possible confessions, you believed they were not guilty of the crimes they were charged with." And in the beginning of the book, you remember, Winston found a photograph that he was supposed to destroy, proving that those three men, at the time when they were accused of the sabotage, had actually been on a different continent, and they were innocent. And here was the proof that the party did lie, that there was a reality separate from what the party said. "You believed that you had seen unmistakable documentary evidence proving that their confessions were false. There was a certain photograph about which you had a hallucination. You believed you had actually held it in your hands. It was a photograph something like this." An oblong slip of newspaper had appeared between O'Brien's fingers. For perhaps 5 seconds, it was in the angle of Winston's vision. It was a photograph, and there was no question of its identity. It was the photograph. It was another copy of the photograph of Jones, Aronson, and Rutherford at the party function in New York, which he had chanced upon 11 years ago and promptly destroyed. For only an instant it was before his eyes, then it was out of sight again. But he had seen it. Unquestionably, he had seen it. Winston made a desperate, agonizing effort to wrench the top half of his body free. It was impossible to move so much as a centimeter in any direction. For the moment, he had even forgotten the dial. All he wanted was to hold the photograph in his fingers again, or at least to see it. "It exists!" he cried. "No," said O'Brien. He stepped across the room. There was a memory hole in the opposite wall. O'Brien lifted the grating. Unseen, the frail slip of paper was whirling away on the current of warm air. It was vanishing in a flash of flame. O'Brien turned away from the wall. "Ashes," he said. "Not even identifiable ashes. Dust. It does not exist. It never existed." "But it did exist," Winston said. "It does exist. It exists in memory. I remember it. You remember it." "I do not remember it," said O'Brien. Winston's heart sank. That was doublethink. He had a feeling of deadly helplessness. If he could have been certain that O'Brien was lying, it would not have seemed to matter, but it was perfectly possible that O'Brien had really forgotten the photograph. And if so, then already he would have forgotten his denial of remembering it and forgotten the act of forgetting. How could one be sure that it was simply trickery? Perhaps that lunatic dislocation in the mind really did happen. That was the thought that defeated him. O'Brien was looking at him speculatively. More than ever, he had the air of a teacher taking pains with a wayward but promising child. O'Brien said, "There is a party slogan dealing with the control of the past. Repeat it, if you please." Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past, repeated Winston obediently. Who controls the present controls the past, said O'Brien, nodding his head with slow approval. Is it your opinion, Winston, that the past has real existence? Again the feeling of helplessness descended upon Winston. His eyes flitted towards the dial. He not only did not know whether yes or no was the answer that would save him from pain, he didn't even know which answer he believed to be the true one. O'Brien smiled faintly. You are no metaphysician, Winston. Until this moment, you had never considered what is meant by existence. I will put it more precisely. Does the past exist concretely in space? Is there somewhere or some other place a world of solid objects where the past is still happening? No, Winston said. Then where does the past exist, if at all? In records. It is written down in records. And in the mind, in human memories. In memory. Very well then. We, the party, control all records, and we control all memories. We then control the past, do we not? But how can you stop people remembering things? Cried Winston, again momentarily forgetting the dial. It is involuntary. It is outside oneself. How can you control memory? You haven't controlled mine. O'Brien's manner grew stern again. He laid his hand on the dial. On the contrary, he said, you have not controlled it. That is what has brought you here. You are here because you have failed in humility, in self-discipline. You would not make the act of submission, which is the price of sanity. You preferred to be a lunatic, a minority of one. And he says, but I tell you, Winston, reality is not external. Reality exists in the human mind and nowhere else. And then he's going to prove it to him. It needs an act of self-destruction, an effort of the will. Do you remember, O'Brien went on, writing in your diary, freedom is the freedom to say that 2 + 2 makes 4. Yes, said Winston. O'Brien held up his left hand. It's backed towards Winston, with the thumb hidden and the 4 fingers extended. How many fingers am I holding up, Winston? 4. And if the party says that it is not 4, but 5, Then how many? 4. The word ended in a gasp of pain. The needle of the dial had shot up to 55. The sweat had sprung out all over Winston's body. The air tore into his lungs and issued again in deep groans, which even by clenching his teeth he could not stop. O'Brien watched him, the 4 fingers still extended. He drew back the lever. This time the pain was only slightly eased. How many fingers, Winston? 4. The needle went up to 60. How many fingers, Winston? 4. 4. What else can I say? 4. The needle must have risen again, but he did not look at it. The heavy, stern face and the 4 fingers filled his vision. The fingers stood up before his eyes like pillars, enormous, blurry, and seeming to vibrate, but unmistakably 4. How many fingers, Winston? 4. Stop it, stop it. How can you go on? 4, 4. How many fingers, Winston? 5, 5, 5. No, Winston, that is no use. You are lying. You still think there are 4. How many fingers, please? 4, 5, 4. Anything you like. Only stop it. Stop the pain. Abruptly, he was sitting up with O'Brien's arm around his shoulders. He had perhaps lost consciousness for a few seconds. The bonds that held his body down were loosened. He felt very cold. He was shaking uncontrollably. His teeth were chattering. The tears were rolling down his cheeks. For a moment, he clung to O'Brien like a baby, curiously comforted by the heavy arm around his shoulders. He had the feeling that O'Brien was his protector, that the pain was something that came from outside, from some other source, and that it was O'Brien who would save him from it. You are a slow learner, Winston, said O'Brien gently. How can I help it? He blubbered. How can I help seeing what's in front of my eyes? 2 into a 4. Sometimes, Winston. Sometimes they are 5. Sometimes they are 3. Sometimes they are all of them at once. You must try harder. It is not easy to become sane. He laid Winston down on the bed, leaving him weak and cold. The doctor comes over and examines Winston's heart to make sure he isn't going to die. It's all right. Again, said O'Brien. The pain flowed into Winston's body. The needle must be at 70, 75. He had shut his eyes this time. He knew that the fingers were still there and still 4. All that mattered was somehow to stay alive until the spasm was over. He had ceased to notice whether he was crying out or not. The pain lessened again. He opened his eyes. O'Brien had drawn back the lever. How many fingers, Winston? 4. I suppose there are 4. I would see 5 if I could. I'm trying to see 5. Which do you wish? To persuade me that you see 5, or really to see them? Really to see them. Again, said O'Brien. Perhaps the needle was at 80, 90. Winston could only intermittently remember why the pain was happening. Behind his screwed-up eyelids, a forest of fingers seemed to be moving in a sort of dance, weaving in and out, disappearing behind one another and reappearing again. He was trying to count them. He could not remember why. He knew only that it was impossible to count them, and that this was somehow due to the mysterious identity between 4 and 5. The pain died down again. When he opened his eyes, it was to find that he was still seeing the same thing. Innumerable fingers, like moving trees, were still streaming past in either direction, crossing and recrossing. He shut his eyes again. How many fingers am I holding up, Winston? I don't know. I don't know. You will kill me if you do that again. 4, 5, 6. In all honesty, I don't know. Better, said O'Brien. A needle slid into Winston's arm. Almost in the same instant, a blissful, healing warmth spread all through his body. The pain was already half forgotten. He opened his eyes and looked up gratefully at O'Brien, at the sight of the heavy, lined face, so ugly and so intelligent. His heart seemed to turn over. If he could have moved, he would have stretched out a hand and laid it on O'Brien's arm. He had never loved O'Brien so deeply as at that moment, and not merely because he had stopped the pain. The old feeling that at bottom it did not matter whether O'Brien was a friend or an enemy had come back. O'Brien was a person who could be talked to. Good for now.